Well, another thing I could do is I could look for world writable files. Or I could look for files that I can write to. Maybe they're not necessarily world writable, but maybe I can write to them. And if those files are potentially affecting how the system runs in some way, then I could abuse that to then escalate to root. So, for example, if I, as hacker, could edit the etc sudoers file, I could give myself sudo permissions and then use that to run sudo to then get root. Hopefully that makes sense. So if I want to see files that I can write to as hacker, I can say find / to search the entire file system, -writable to see which files I can write to, and then I can redirect any errors to dev null. Because when you run find, a lot of the times, if I'm trying to search directories that I don't actually have access to, it'll throw an error. I don't want to see those errors, so I'm just redirecting errors with that too over to dev null, which basically says errors be gone, right? I could run this by itself, but think about it. Hacker probably has a lot of files that they can write to, including their own files. I want to look for files that are potentially unusual that hacker might be able to write to. So some potentially unusual files include files that are owned by root, right? It would be pretty unusual for a user like hacker to be able to write to a file that's owned by root. So if I say -user root, I can specifically search files that are owned by root. Running this, we see a lot of files that aren't that interesting to me, like files in the run directory, files in the dev directory aren't very interesting to me. So I can further refine my search here. I'm actually going to pipe this output into grep, and I'm going to use grep-v to exclude lines that contain a certain string. So I could use grep-v to exclude lines that contain the word run. Again, I'm still getting dev. I also don't care about anything that's in the dev directory. That's not super interesting to me. So I could say run or dev. But because I'm using this special character, this vertical bar that is an OR symbol, I'm going to have to use egrep that tells grep, hey, look for special characters that mean certain things in my output. So basically this grep here says look for anything that contains run and dev, and because we added -v, exclude those lines. Okay. Now we're seeing sys and proc. Those also aren't very interesting to me, so I can add sys and I can add proc here. And we're left with some files that may be interesting. The one that really stands out here is this etc password. So it looks like, as hacker, we can modify the etc password file. And if we can modify etc password, we may be able to use that to then escalate privileges and gain root. If you're familiar with how passwords are read in Linux, most of the time passwords are stored in etc shadow, and they're not stored in their password format. They're stored in an kind of encrypted in a way format called a hash, right? However, the way Linux actually goes about checking a user's password is first they look for it in etc password. And then if it's not present in etc password, then it's going to go over and look for it in etc shadow. So if we can write to etc password, we can actually overwrite a password for a specific user. So if I nano etc password, it warns me that directory etc is not writable, but that's not an issue because this actual file itself is. So I can actually overwrite the root user's password by changing this X here to any password that I want. Now, a quick note is that password actually has to be written as a hash, so not as a password, but as the hashed version of the password. So we're going to have to calculate that. Fortunately, we can use the OpenSSL utility to do that. So I'm going to switch over to my other terminal tab here. I'm going to say OpenSSL, the hash format, and in this case, it's just for the password file, so passwd. And then I can choose any password I want. So let's say I want the password to be test. And that gives me a hash that looks like this. So I'm going to right-click, copy, And I'm just going to throw that in here, right-click, paste. And I'm going to save that file. And now if I print out the contents of etc password, you'll notice that root's password was overwritten with this hash. And of course, this hash corresponds to the password test. So now we should be able to log in as root using password test. So if I use su to switch user to root, and then I put in password test, now I was able to switch to root. So the underlying vulnerability here is that we had that etc password could be written to by the hacker user, right? And that allowed me to then specify any password I want for root and then use that password to switch to root. So as defenders, how would we go about fixing that? Well, let's check the permissions on that file. So if I look at etc passwd, it looks like if you see the root user can read, write, and execute the file, and the root group can read and execute the file, but anybody other can also write to that password file, and that's bad. So to fix that, I can say sudo chmod, and let's just say we're taking away write access from other, so I can say O-W, or I could use numbers if you prefer using numbers. So 755 etc password. Of course, I have to actually do this as a user that can run sudo, right? So I'm going to exit out of this hacker shell, and I'm going to do that as a user. Etc password. And now if I list the permissions on that file again, this time you'll notice that password is no longer world writable. So if I were to switch to hacker, and if I were to try to write to it again with nano, this time it tells me at the bottom that file etc password is unwritable. And so if I try to make changes to it, like let's say I try to mess it up and I try to save that, it says permission denied and I'm not able to write to it. The second thing I'm going to want to do as a defender is I'm going to want to get rid of that password that the attacker put in there. So if I say sudo nano etc passwd, sorry, I have to do this as a user again. So I'm going to exit out of there, sudo nano etc passwd, go in there, remove this hashed password, and replace it with an X that tells it to go look in the etc shadow file for the actual password. Now if I write that out, now if I switch back to user hacker, and I try to switch from hacker to root with password test, now that no longer works. We get an authentication failure. So in summary, the underlying problem here was bad permissions on that etc password file. So in order to fix that as defenders, we had to go in and change the permissions on that etc password file.